With the inevitable release of Elden Ring's DLC on its way, I figured I would make this video to share some of my thoughts and opinions of this game for anyone out there who enjoys listening to discourse about game design, or who just like to get angry and watch other people get angry at opinions. In the wake of the growing popularity of long-form video essays, I am attempting to condense a lot of my thoughts into a relatively short video. I hope. The TLDR of this video is that Elden Ring's greatest strength is its visual presentation and continuation of the solid legacy gameplay of past Souls games. It does not, however, benefit from a shift to an open-world design, and largely suffers from continuing the notion that Dark Souls must be hard, as well as the philosophy that previous Souls games have had regarding its story and world building. Overall, I give Elden Ring a 6 out of 10. Now, if you've never passed a math class before in your life, you may be under the impression that 6 out of 10 is a low score, but it is above average. Elden Ring is above average because it, on top of being a fully functioning experience, is well produced and offers a lot of gameplay. But that gameplay is so rough around the edges, it might as well be considered a workplace hazard. That's not to say I think you won't enjoy Elden Ring, but that I would only recommend the game to people who are either already genuinely interested in the series or the game, or for people who are diehard fans of previous Souls games. I am an open-world game enjoyer, although many of my favorite games, and many games in general, are classically linear experiences. Both non-linear and linear styles of game design can make for great game experiences, but they each have their strengths and weaknesses. Open worlds generally have the following strengths. They allow for a true sense of adventure, and allow for exploration in ways that linear games don't allow for. A relatively recent paradigm shift in open-world design philosophy is allowing the player greater freedom of movement by allowing climbing or other modes of travel. This allows the developers to create denser, more complex environments without having to necessarily factor player movement into their design. This ties into a shift towards visual identification. Content is more visible to players thanks to their ability to navigate the world more freely, allowing players to find content without the need for metagame elements like map markers or quest objectives. These things can still help in the right places, but they reduce the feeling that the player is checking off boxes on a list, and instead allow players to become more immersed in the game world. Open world games are often much longer than linear, closed world games, and this isn't necessarily better or worse, as each style suits different moods and preferences. Building content in an open world also allows players to set the pace for their experience. You can focus on progressing the story, or you can go off and do some side content. You might search for some enemies to fight, or you might look for a puzzle that needs solving. Being able to choose where to go, as mundane as it may be on paper, is still a refreshing and enjoyable experience for a lot of players. You can also have a lot of replayability by changing the order in which you do content, or the approach you take when completing that content. These strengths are, however, not without their own weaknesses. Letting the player discover content on their own means that sometimes they're going to miss things. Developers need to take into consideration how it might negatively affect the player's experience if they miss a crucial piece of content. Open-world games may have a lot of content, but a lot of the times this is very low-intensity gameplay due to restrictions on the developers who have to make that content. This means a lot of times gameplay boils down to a simple puzzle or a short combat encounter. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as the player is engaged with the content. It doesn't matter if you've given them a 2-step puzzle or a 30-step puzzle. But if the player doesn't feel a strong urge to do the content in the game, it doesn't matter how many different pieces of interest you have, they're gonna ignore it all. The content in an open world also needs to be dense. You may have heard of this forlorn and forgotten concept they used to call Ubisoft, where open worlds were littered with pointless collectibles, and all of the content is distantly separated by boring travel times. If you want to make an open world that's so huge for the sake of making a huge world, you better give the player a cool way to travel across that world, or a really fast way of traveling, otherwise they're gonna be bored out of their minds. An issue that is nigh unavoidable in game design, and especially in open worlds, is reused content. On one hand, you might call it a clever way that developers can save time, energy, and resources by reworking assets into new content, and on the other hand, you might call it copy-pasting. The Dark Souls community is very vocal about copy-pasted content, but we'll get to that. In general, as long as only minor content is reused so as to allow the major pieces to be fresh and exciting, then reusing content is a-okay in my book. The last concern with open worlds that I can think of is that open world content is difficult to design around with great intent. While being able to approach something from different directions and in various orders allows for creativity and replayability, it also means that developers need to account for a wider range of variables when considering how difficult content will be, how the player will interpret visual cues, or how the game might react to players completing content in different orders. At the risk of making everyone who watches this video very angry, I'm going to compare Elden Ring to another open world game which I have historically enjoyed very much. Despite all of its flaws, you have to admit that Breath of the Wild was revolutionary for the genre of open world games. In the past, open world suffered from either not being open enough to allow for true exploration, or relied way too heavily on things like vehicle travel and map markers in order for players to discover content. Breath of the Wild brought into the mainstream a design philosophy based on visually seeing content and then giving the player the ability to travel to it with whatever means available to them. In between major pieces of content, you then have minor pieces of content strewn about the world in an even layer, acting as a series of dots that the player can connect to and complete as they make their way to the major content they identified earlier. While this type of content design results in a lot of low-intensity, repeat concepts and ideas, it allows for an experience that consistently has the player's attention, with new content being carefully placed near others to allow the player to naturally discover points of interest, with a chain-like effect. Now that finally brings us to Elden Ring, where the open world, as expansive as it is a mostly barren wasteland, with content spread so thinly across this open plains, you spend more time checking your map like you're looking for directions on a boring road trip. Let's break it down. Elden Ring falls into the same trappings of open world games like Skyrim and Cyberpunk, relying heavily on the map and not the visuals of the world to communicate and direct the player. It's just that now instead of map markers, you just have a vaguely labeled map, but the icons are still there. Many reused locations have the same identifiable marker on the map that you can look for, and then stride towards on torrent, ignoring the rest of the meticulously crafted world around you, because there's nothing there for you. To be fair to Elden Ring, there is quite a lot of content in the game when you can find it. There are lots of little dungeons and encounters to get stuck into, but there is an equal amount of content in this game that simply amounts to picking up an item, or opening a chest, or finding the stairs in the ruins. There is a noticeable amount of stuff in Elden Ring that literally takes no brain power to complete, because zero effort was put in to design a gameplay mechanic that encourages the player to engage with it. This is exacerbated by another issue that has plagued the Souls series since its earliest entry. The risk-reward ratio of many encounters is heavily skewed against the player's favor. When you die in Dark Souls, you lose your money, which also doubles as experience to gain levels with, and you drop it on a puddle on the floor. If you die again, any of your dropped souls are lost forever, which means that dying doesn't just punish you with having to redo the level, but potentially means losing out on a resource that makes the player stronger and makes the game easier as a result. Because of this, many Souls players will learn that ignoring enemies is oftentimes more practical than actually fighting them. Why bother fighting a really tough enemy for a pittance of souls when the area bosses reward far more in exchange for only having to learn that single fight? As the series has progressed into Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, FromSoft kept making the enemies harder and harder to fight, while still rewarding players effectively nothing of value for taking the time to learn those fights. This problem is then magnified in Elden Ring even more because it's an open world. Not only are the enemies balanced even worse than in Dark Souls 3, but you now have a second health bar in the form of a horse that allows you to ignore the enemies even harder than you could in the past games. When I said the open world is barren in Elden Ring, that isn't entirely true because there are a lot of enemies scattered throughout this world, But why would you fight any of them when 1. They can kill you and potentially make you lose valuable resources, 2. They reward you almost nothing in return, 3. They're almost all badly balanced and frustrating to fight, and 4. The developers gave you a horse to ride on, and they put all of the items out in the open free for the taking.
Then I'm going through this castle, and the enemies are too hard to kill, so I find myself running past them just to get ahead. But that's not the mark of a good game, is it? Because doesn't it mean that you're not enjoying the game if all you want to do is bypass everything so you can get the game over as quick as possible?
There is also a lot of content reuse in Elden Ring. Now, I'm not the pickiest person when it comes to reused content in games, as you can tell by the game I chose as a comparison, but the important thing for me is that the memorable sections of a game are unique, and they stand out as memories, and that whatever content is being reused is a part of the game that is enjoyable and engaging. The puzzles in Breath of the Wild may all be reused concepts and have the same parts, but you still have to take the time to look at them and analyze each one as a unique puzzle. We'll talk about boss fights later, but for now it's worth pointing out how so many of the points of interest in Elden Ring not only reuse visual assets, but reuse the same boring concepts. It gets pretty boring knowing the exact solution to 99% of all of the ruins or catacombs before you even get close to them, because they all follow the same cookie-cutter formula. There's a stairway in every ruin, there's a statue with a lever in almost every dungeon. To be fair to Elden Ring, there are a few locations with truly unique and memorable events happening at them, but they are the exception, not the rule. Almost every location in the game is a bunch of copy-pasted assets with a boss that you've seen before or an item just lying on the ground waiting for you to take it. A severe lack of design plagues the game's open world. Not only are the locations not very interesting, but the open world format severely harms the balance of the game and the consistency of player experiences. Another extremely common and valid criticism of the Souls series is a heavy reliance on community knowledge and resources in order to enjoy the games. In past Souls games, this could be something like knowing where certain items are to optimize a build, knowing where the Titanite items are in order to upgrade your weapons early, or just knowing the specific weaknesses of enemies and bosses. Elden Ring somehow does this even worse than any other Souls game. For one, the poor balancing of the enemies combined with the open world makes for a very confusing and volatile experience, where you can go from baby tier Limgrave to Dante must die Caelid in a matter of minutes. This isn't some funny RPG where the level 99 Mafia boss is hanging around on the first level of the game as an obstacle for you to avoid. Caelid itself is significantly harder than Liurnia, but is just as accessible as the Weeping Peninsula, an early game area that you're meant to do before finding the first dungeon, but many players will find that first dungeon before finding the Weeping Peninsula. To add insult to injury, there are places within Caelid that are meant to be as difficult as endgame content, while other portions are meant to be completed as early as after beating that first dungeon, which just makes things even more confusing. A much more noticeable issue has to do with those upgrade materials. Elden Ring reuses the same weapon upgrade system from past Souls games, and just like in past games, being able to find early upgrade materials can make a huge difference in how difficult the game is early on. Players who have prior knowledge, or who use community-made resources can have a massive advantage against players who might find the game overly frustrating and difficult just because they missed out on some of the upgrade materials. Elden Ring takes this up past 11. You can find Iji the Blacksmith hanging out in Liurnia without any prerequisites to talk to him and buy from his shop. You can get up to tier 4 of somber smithing stones from him, and if you know where to look, you can get bell bearings for tier 12 normal weapons. This is a huge upgrade in the early game. On top of this, you can get up to plus 10 healing flasks by finding all of the golden sneeds and sacred tears scattered throughout the world. Almost all of these materials I just talked about require no boss fighting or puzzle solving or any real engagement. You just have to know where these things are and go straight to them. Despite being so trivial to acquire, they make a massive difference in the game's difficulty, and absolutely shatter any semblance of balance the game has. There are also strong talismans and cheese strategies for tough bosses that can net players lots of easy runes in the early game. Players who have this knowledge can take full advantage, making the game too easy, while those who don't will find the game overly difficult and frustrating. If the developers had put more thought and care into designing their open world, they could have fine-tuned this aspect of the game to make sure that it was well balanced and fun. But as we'll see with the actual combat, I highly recommend you go out of your way to grab these early upgrades to make the game as enjoyable as possible, as much as you can possibly do that. There's one last thing that should be mentioned on about how Souls formula doesn't cohere to open world, and that's player builds. In a Souls game, you're limited in what kinds of equipment and spells you can use by the statistics of your character. This isn't a problem when you're just beating a level and you pick up an item that you can't use, but in Elden Ring, many items serve as the primary reward for content. It feels really bad getting to the end of an annoying dungeon, only to find out your reward is a weapon you can't even use. At least you'll still get runes for your trouble, but it really hurts the experience when you have so many of your rewards being literally unusable because of the game mechanics. I'm fine with the justification that the journey is more important than the destination regarding the fun of the content itself, but this also means that certain builds which want specific items will be locked out of them if those items are located in endgame dungeons. You'd think that one of the strengths of an open world is the ability to go to wherever you want and get these items first thing, but despite being an open world, the game still gates your progress at certain points and forces you to fight certain bosses, unless you plan on getting a friend to drop you an item, or you want to do an exploit to get to a further point of the game, or just straight up cheat. In summary, there is a large portion of content in Elden Ring which requires very little to no interaction to complete. The Dark Souls formula does not make for a good open world due to the poor balance of risk and reward. There is a comical amount of content reuse, with very little effort put into distinguishing areas or creating memorable moments. The difficulty of areas and the intended progression path for players is poorly conveyed, and the balancing of rewards and player progression related to the open world is laughably bad. To be clear, I'm not saying that the games that I've compared to Elden Ring are perfect. They have their flaws, but Elden Ring clearly didn't have any thought put into its open world other than make it an open world Dark Souls game, without considering the necessary changes the game would need to have in order to be more cohesive and enjoyable. There are too many things wrong with the current design of the game that fixing it would require extensive reworking of the existing content. But if I could put on my fedora and make some napkin drawing suggestions, I would have each minor location require the player to do something interesting in order to claim the items there. I would rebalance the world enemies to be more rewarding to fight or less risky to challenge. I would restructure player progression so that players who Google search for the upgrade materials aren't at a massive advantage against players who play blind. I would cut out a ton of the boring, copy-pasted content and put those rewards in those dungeons as items in the legacy dungeons, and I would make more legacy dungeons. Talking about difficulty and combat in Dark Souls is almost as contentious as talking about its story and lore, which is why I'm saving that point for last. There are so many issues with Elden Ring's continuations of the Souls series combat that it would take far too long to elaborate on all of them. So I'm going to briefly go over the major ones that stick out like multiple broken thumbs on a grafted scion's body. The input reading in Elden Ring is comical. This was somewhat apparent in past Souls games with bosses trying to punish healing attempts with certain moves, but they just went completely overboard in Elden Ring in order to make the game more difficult. And they succeeded, while also making the encounters needlessly unfun. Punishing the player for making space between the boss and them to heal, when 99% of the other bosses aren't going to do that, is dumb. It's arbitrary, and it's only there to make the boss harder without teaching the player about a mechanic or giving them a clear line of action to get around it. Many of the endgame bosses in Elden Ring have an obscene amount of HP. This was a problem for a few bosses in Dark Souls 3, but it is so bad in Elden Ring that I recommend you use the Black Blade incantation, the Black Knife weapon art, or any of the Black Flame incantations that deal proportional HP damage versus those endgame bosses. It is just that effective. As someone who has been recently enjoying Code Vein, I can understand the difficulty of balancing enemy AI around multiple players. Elden Ring has spirit summons, which act as offline co-op partners, while Code Vein has its difficulty tuned intentionally hard in order to balance against the permanently available AI partners. Dark Souls has always seen cooperative play as kind of an easy mode, and it's just as poorly balanced in Elden Ring, with some Spirit Ashes having hilariously powerful stats, special effects, bonus evasion, and the magical ability to break the enemy's AI by splitting the aggro between you and them. I'm not trying to say that Code Vein did it perfectly, but I am saying that Elden Ring doesn't even try when this is an issue that's been with every single Souls game. For as much of a big stink everyone always makes with how Dark Souls 2 copied and reused so many of its bosses, you have to wonder why no one makes the same complaint about Elden Ring. Just because it's an open world doesn't change the fact that by my count, out of about 89 different types of bosses, only 20 or so are used only once, and I'm being extremely generous by counting the named NPCs you fight as different bosses, and the different named dragons, because they technically use different elements. If you don't count the NPCs and dragons, the only thematically unique bosses are the Elden Beast, the Fire Giant, Horaloo, Millennia, Placidusax, Radagon, Renala, Rykard, and Grail. I would like to reiterate that I am not picky about content reuse, but you cannot deny how many of the bosses in Elden Ring are just promoted enemies, or literally copy-pasted. Even bosses that seem like they should be unique to their encounters, like Astel the Natural Born and Godric the Grafted, end up being reused at least one more time. It really hurts the uniqueness of an encounter when you see the same jackass get reused in some random cave somewhere. The real issue I have with this isn't the reuse, it's the hypocrisy of everyone slamming other games for reusing some of their bosses. Meanwhile, Elden Ring doesn't have an original bone left in its body, or an original branch left in its tree. In the pursuit of difficulty over substance, FromSoft has started turning to cheap tricks you would expect to see in a Kaizo game. The abnormally long delays in the boss's attacks are something everyone noticed early in the game's release, but as funny as it is to make fun of, it's just bad design. It's simply a beginner's trap that preys on your intuition. These random delays are something you simply learn through trial and error, and with how easy it is to die in these games, you get very few opportunities to trial and understand what you're supposed to do to solve the attack. I don't mind a challenge, but this is a pure example of FromSoft creating a challenge, and then just putting as many obstacles in your way in order to prevent you from learning and engaging with the challenge. More so than in any other Souls game before it, the bosses in Elden Ring absolutely love to run away from the player. It might be because they have long movement baked into their attacks, or it's literally designed into their AI to run away from the player, or both. Either way, these kinds of encounters are wholly stupid in their design, because half of the time the player isn't even engaged. You spend more time sprinting towards the boss than you actually do dodging or attacking. Something especially noticeable with bosses like Margit and the Sanguine Noble are a tendency to randomly extend or end combos. These changes in pattern are made specifically to screw with the player, like how the Sanguine Noble will extend its long combo only if you stay close and try to punish it, but it will stop early if you make distance so you won't be able to punish it at all. These changes in attack pattern are not clearly conveyed to the player, and they only serve to make the fights feel less consistent and more difficult to learn. I repeatedly fought Margit to record him doing his attacks because a close friend of mine insisted that there was a clear visual cue for when he was going to extend or not, but after observing the footage, I can't say that that is true.
Don't you feel silly? Don't you feel stupid?
The last point I want to make against the combat in Elden Ring is something that originates in Dark Souls 3. There are enemies in Elden Ring which are absolutely gigantic. This poses the simple issue that the camera doesn't capture the entire enemy in view, requiring the player to guess based on the movement of the enemy's limbs on what they're going to do. It is extremely hard to learn an attack and roll timings this way, and for many of these enemies, you simply cannot lock onto them, as enemies in Elden Ring frantically lunge and swipe in a way that locking the camera onto them causes it to swerve around violently. It also doesn't fix the issue that even while locked on, you might not be able to see the whole enemy. Other action games in the genre have learned about the magical and foreign concept of zooming out the camera, but FromSoft still hasn't gotten the memo. FromSoft has historically struggled to write proper stories in their Souls games, which is really bizarre, because one of the most prevalent memes of Dark Souls is deep lore. People seem to blow out of proportion the quality of the Souls series stories because of third parties making analyses of the games, while the actual story content of the games has always been really poor, with the exception of Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls had a story. It introduced the world, the antagonist, it gave your character a reason to care, it showed the effects of your actions on the world, and it ended clearly with a succinct and satisfying ending. In comparison, Elden Ring starts off by introducing the world, a whole boatload of random characters, doesn't give you a strong motivation to proceed with the story, and then tasks you with killing a bunch of random people for no logical reason. Then you get to the end of the game, and shocker, the organization you thought were the good guys are actually the bad guys for no reason. Then you go kill some more bosses to solve the random problem that was randomly introduced with a random solution, but not before being taken to a completely random place to get a thing you weren't even told you needed to fulfill the plan you never knew you had. Then you kill God. Then the game is over. There are so many things to pick apart here, but before we pick some nits, there's something I should get out of the way. Why do I care that the story in Elden Ring is poor or lacking? Why is it bad for Elden Ring to not have a story, while it's fine for a game like, say, Tetris, to not have one? It's because Tetris doesn't try to have a story to begin with. I can't criticize Tetris' story for being bad, because it isn't there at all, but I also can't criticize it for not living up to my expectations, because it never tries to set them in the first place. There's a difference between not trying to make a story and not trying with your story. Tetris doesn't try to make a story. Elden Ring doesn't try with its story. Does Elden Ring have a story? Well, Elden Ring has characters. It has a world. There's an introduction sequence that tries to imply the importance of these things. Your actions in the world appear to have some kind of influence on it, and the endings try to give all of those events some kind of closure, but it all fails. I've played through Elden Ring multiple times. I've seen all of the bosses, all of the characters, all of the dungeons, and most of the endings. I still don't know what happened or why any of it happened. The beginning introduces a lot of concepts and asks a lot of questions, but the most important ones aren't answered. Who is Radagon? Who is Marika? Why did they choose to shatter the Elden Ring? Did they shatter the Elden Ring? It's implied in the introduction, but it's never clearly stated. Radagon and Marika are implied to be the same person. Are they a split personality of a single combined entity? Is Radagon simply a shell for Marika to exist in? Is Radagon a clone, or an alter ego of Marika? Many possibilities present themselves in this game's story, but none are addressed, and if it is, then it isn't clearly conveyed at all. Dark Souls has always been notorious for its item descriptions picking up the slack for the story's presentation, but it just can't do enough to save these games. Storytelling isn't just about having good ideas and writing them down. You need to present them to the audience in a way that is entertaining and helps them understand your ideas and message. It's one thing to write a script, it's another thing to direct a play. FromSoft has always been great at writing scripts. They have been historically very bad at making plays. Is Elden Ring's story actually masterfully executed and life-changing in its content and quality? I'll never know, because I can't find it anywhere in this game, and believe me when I tell you I've dedicated more than enough time to have reasonably found it. If you want to try and argue to me that I'm just bad, and the story is obvious, go ahead and try, but you better be ready to cough up some citations from the game itself, and not someone's interpretation. What little story does exist in the game does nothing to add or help explain the existing story. In fact, the story only seems to get more and more confusing the more you think about it. The obvious issue is that we don't really know what the Elden Ring does, or what Radagon/Marika's endgame is. This is the core plot point of the game, and it's never really expanded on. Why did the Elden Ring shatter? What even is the Elden Ring? I want to be clear that I'm not asking for a good explanation, but just a explanation. The story could have been that Marika was controlling the world, and Radagon wanted to break free from that, and so shattered the Elden Ring because it was the source of Marika's influence, but this sent the world into chaos, and now Marika is trying to get her power back by using the player as a pawn. Maybe your character is someone who has lived in this world their whole life, and it was ruined by the shattering, so now you're invested, you live here, you want things to go back to normal, so you take Marika's word as truth when she promises to you that if you beat Radagon, everything will go back to the way it was. Then the other characters in the story could serve to reveal the truth behind what happened, to inform your decisions when you reach the end of the game. Maybe what I just described is in fact the plot to Elden Ring, but I wouldn't know, because there's so little that get explained. I don't know why our character wants to be Elden Lord. I don't know what Melina's goals are. I don't know why she wants to be taken to the Erdtree. I don't know why the Elden Ring shattered, and I don't know why Marika is trying to stop us from fixing it. Why does Gideon help you all throughout the game, and then betray you at the end? Why is Iji killed by Black Knife Assassins, when Black Knife Assassins are depicted in the introduction as opposing the gods, which is what Ranni has been doing the whole time? Why is the Greater Will said to be part of the Golden Order, but then the Frenzy Flame ending implies that the Greater Will wants to destroy and reset the world? Speaking of Frenzy Flame, how do Yura and Hayeta come back to life? Just randomly, it's never explained. This is a problem that the entire Souls franchise has struggled to resolve, that death and resurrection is a canonical event in the stories. This is something that the games really should have just left out as a meta element of the gameplay, something to not be considered for the story. If resurrection is a canon event in the games, why do NPCs die? It was an interesting idea to imply that hollows you fight in Dark Souls are literally players who gave up on beating the game because the game sucks. I mean, the game was too hard. But it's also a gigantic hole in the plot that we can't ignore. Fia's entire faction is dedicated to the notion that people can die, and that Fia can resurrect them specifically through her special power. But they're tarnished, right? Why can't they just resurrect themselves like you can? This kind of contradiction that breaks so many rules would be a big issue in any other story. But I guess it's a-okay, because this is a FromSoft story. It doesn't have to make sense. Time is convoluted. Just read the lore and come to your own conclusions. Who needs writers when the player base will just write the stories themselves through their own interpretations? You can't say the story makes no sense because it's interpretive. You can't say the rules were broken if you never try to establish them in the first place. You can't say the story is filled with holes if the story is just a gigantic hole. There is no story. It's time for some quality of life and other issues with the series that I've always had, despite them being common criticisms throughout the entire lifetime of the franchise. NPC questlines remain almost completely unfollowable. NPCs in Elden Ring continue the tradition of NPC appears in a random place, and the player talks to them. The NPC requests an item or asks for a boss to be killed. Then, once they do this, repeat with the NPC appearing in another random place and the player talking to them. Do this over and over until the NPC dies or randomly disappears. That's the end of the quest. You almost always need to use blind luck or follow a guide to complete many of the quests in Souls games, and because of the open world used in Elden Ring, it's even harder for the player to just happen upon an NPC in the correct order they're supposed to be encountered in. If the developers are so stubborn to not include the most basic of quest journals, they could have at least put some more effort into telling the player in an organic way where the NPCs are going to be next. Some of the NPCs do this, but they're still vague about it, and most don't even do this much. FromSoft budged a little in this regard when they added NPC markers on the world map in an update, and this helps, but it doesn't fix the problem at its core, because when those NPCs move, their markers disappear until you find them again. This reminds me of a really magical moment I had with a quest in Breath of the Wild. In this quest, you're helping a ghost from the distant past recover books for their library. One of the books, the only clue you're given is that it was taken by a guy and they went to a specific named place and he was hoping to turn it into a novel. Players who have been paying attention to the story and world in this game will immediately recognize the name of the place and the fact that there's a prominent bookshop there, and if you go straight there, you'll find the book. No quest marker, it was just there. It was natural, organic. This kind of quest design is what open worlds are made for, and to be fair against Breath of the Wild, it doesn't always do this kind of thing with all of its quests, but in comparison to Elden Ring, you at least have quests with stories and arcs and beginnings and endings and clear progression guiding the player through them. All of these things are things that FromSoft has historically lacked in. FromSoft's implementation of New Game Plus continues to be a waste of potential in Elden Ring. In all of the Souls series, New Game Plus has done nothing but bump up the damage scaling of enemies, increase soul drops, and if your name is Dark Souls 2, then maybe you put some new enemies around, and in all of the games, I think you get new rings, but that's it. That's at best. In Elden Ring, I don't even think you get new items or enemy placements in New Game Plus. The point of New Game Plus is to be a new game, but with some extra options given to the player to spice up their playthrough. The obvious potential here is for replayability. The reason why a player would even start another playthrough at all is to do a different build or to get a different ending, maybe try a different route through the game. But From has always made New Game Plus retain your weapon upgrades and character levels, which obliterates the balance of the game, even ignoring the added enemy scaling. It's not New Game Plus. It's just a continuation of the previous playthrough, and to From's credit, they've never really called it New Game Plus, they've just called it Journey 2, Journey 3, Journey 4. But Elden Ring is especially bad about this because of how big its world is. If you want to do a playthrough with a specific weapon or spell, you're going to be forced to play through a large portion of the game without it first before you get that item, or you'd need to carefully skip as much content as possible and potentially do a lot of difficult content just to get that one item you want. This is what happened to me when I tried doing a lightning build, as most of the lightning weapons are gated past the mid-game. All of this could have been avoided if New Game Plus did what it was supposed to and let you start a brand new game, but with the ability to retain your collectibles without keeping upgrades and levels to maintain the balance. But it's never been like that. In none of From's games has it ever been like that. It's just such wasted potential. Once again, stat reallocations in Elden Ring are a finite resource, and class changes are fully restricted. I can't imagine why From still decides to limit these things, especially when they try to support PvP content as much as they do. If you want to try a different build, I guess you should just be prepared to eventually be forced to make a new character because there's a finite number of respecs you can do, and you could never change your base class. I'm fully aware that for a casual playthrough, you rarely need more than 1 or 2 respecs. But it would be nice if you could do it infinitely, and it wouldn't break the game or be that hard to implement, so I don't know why From insists that this be a limited resource. The upgrade system in the Souls games has never been great because of how it limits the player's choices in what weapons they use. Ignoring the fact that the rune cost of upgrading weapons is already a lot, there's a limited number of the highest tier of upgrade stone, meaning you have a limited number of weapons you can fully upgrade. It's not the biggest of deals since the final upgrade isn't always the most significant. Well, I mean, it almost always is, but why did the developers go through the effort of implementing a way to buy upgrade stones and not let you buy the last tier? To be perfectly honest, I don't even like the current stone system, because you still have to be picky about what weapons you use. A much better system would be to make it so that rather than upgrade individual weapons, you tier up your character's gear level at a blacksmith, making all of your weapons match that gear level. Then, if you wanted to, you could have the option of picking what gear level you want your character to be at using the blacksmith, in case you wanted to downgrade for PvP or co-op reasons. One thing that some of the Souls series copycats have actually done better than FromSoft is multiplayer. In games like Code Vein, entering co-op play is way simpler than in Elden Ring. You just move around some menus and there you go, multiplayer. Elden Ring retains the unique but comically inefficient and tired method of finding summon signs and waiting around before you can summon someone. Not to mention with how big and open Elden Ring is, you'd think one of the biggest draws would be exploring the world and tackling bosses together with a friend, but it's just not implemented that well. At the very least, the password system from Dark Souls 3 returns, and it helps mitigate the summon sign ceiling from older games. And FromSoft mercifully removed invasions for single players, but there's a lot of potential for improvement with cooperative play, and other games have done this before it. Why hasn't FromSoft just chosen to copy the copycats? It's better. I'm not even going to comment on PvP. It's still the same laggy, unbalanced nonsense that it has always been with Souls games. It isn't something that appeals to me, and even if it did appeal to me, it's a slap in the face to anyone who has even tried any other modern competitive game made in the last decade or two. The PvP in Souls games is so comically lackluster, buggy, exploitable, and unbalanced, it almost makes Super Smash Bros. Look like it's an Olympic sport. The DLC for Elden Ring is well on its way, so before it comes out, I have some desires that I hope will be fulfilled with the DLC. I highly doubt it, but here goes. In the current version of Elden Ring, Faith and Arcane builds dominate the game. Bleed is still comically effective against many enemies, as is Frostbite. Frenzy puts the brakes on any PvP interaction, and the Faith incantations are the strongest spells in the game due to their high enemy health being countered by the proportional health damage of some incantations. Despite most enemies resisting holy damage in the endgame, fire now scales with strength and faith, and many of the strongest weapons also scale with this, like the Blasphemous Blade, and conversely, many of those holy resistant enemies in Elden Ring are also weak to fire due to their association with trees. In stark comparison, intelligence builds are just okay. They've had some nerfs in the past, but they have good options with not that many great melee options. Lightning and physical builds are the ones that suffer the most, with lightning weapons not scaling with anything besides dexterity, despite lightning incantations still requiring faith to use. Raw physical builds can work, but they miss out on a lot of that utility that magic brings, and they usually end up dealing less damage than arcane builds and other magic builds as a result. The first thing I hope the DLC brings is more options for hybrid magic builds. Intelligence and arcane, and Intelligence and Faith are the most lacking magic options in the game. The Sword of Night and Flame was gutted, leaving Intelligence and Faith with pretty much no options other than one Sacred Seal. Intelligence Arcane is limited to Frostbite, which Arcane does just fine on its own, and a small handful of Bubble and Briar spells, all of which suck butt. Another good addition would be more Intelligence Dexterity and Faith Strength weapons. The game notably already has a lot of Intelligence Strength options and Faith Dexterity options, which leaves the other half of that physical equation notably lacking. Better lightning weapons should hopefully be added in the DLC. As stated previously, most of the weapons that naturally possess lightning damage in Elden Ring don't scale with Faith, but the incantations that produce lightning damage do scale with Faith. Lightning infusions also scale primarily with Dexterity, which is confusing. Regardless of how it scales, the current suite of lightning weapons in the game just suck, with the best option being the Bolt of Grandsax, which requires you to spam the Ash of War on it, and some weapons don't even deal lightning damage until you use the Ash of War. To summarize my thoughts on Elden Ring, it's okay. FromSoft has continued to get away with doing the bare minimum because of complacency from the fans. The archaic system mechanics of old games like weapon upgrades and summoning signs remain in the game, despite other games in the genre showing improvement. The story in the game is laughably bad because the developers know that players will overanalyze the setting and world to write their own interpretations. Rather than designing bosses that are balanced and engaging to fight, the bosses are copy-pasted, have bloated health and damage numbers, and rely on cheap tricks in order to beat the player because fans insist that the game must be hard and that you can't possibly be having fun unless you've died to the boss over and over again. Elden Ring is undoubtedly the prettiest and most atmospheric in the Souls series, and that shouldn't be ignored. The presentation in the game is fantastic, and for the second time since Bloodborne, the character customization is great, and player characters don't look ugly as sin. I still wouldn't feel confident in recommending Elden Ring to just anyone. FromSoft has certainly succeeded in making their games difficult to approach, but at the risk of playing semantics, I don't think that's because the games are genuinely challenging, but that they're designed to put off players by frustrating them. Souls games don't require you to perform hundreds of perfect inputs or solve a very complex, multi-layered problem. Rather, you're tasked with pressing the dodge button maybe 10 times every few minutes and 50 or so times during a boss fight. This isn't complex or taxing, but to counteract that, if you make 1 or 2 mistakes in a row, you lose and you have to try again. The task isn't particularly hard, but the punishment is a loading screen and the game pointing the finger at you like you're the one who fucked up. A rhythm game asks a lot from a player if they want to master it, but the bar to just succeed in a rhythm game is pretty low. Even on harder difficulties, you can get away with making a fair number of mistakes and still beating the songs. What's important to note here is that players can still have fun with the game without needing to have mastered it. We love to make fun of games journalists for being bad and asking for easier difficulty settings in games, but the debate about that really makes me think. The thing we dislike about asking for easier difficulties is that the people who ask for them are truly incompetent, and lowering the bar isn't going to encourage them to learn, put effort in, or get better. But failure in playing a video game isn't always the player's fault. If the player is paying attention, has good hand-eye coordination, and is giving their fair share of effort, but is still failing, is that their fault? Or is that a failure of the creator of the game? If I fail at a math test because my methods were wrong and so are my answers, that's on me. But if I fail at a math test because there were questions on the test that I've never seen before, is it my fault for not knowing those answers? Or is it the test creator's fault for testing me on irrelevant concepts? Is it my fault for not knowing that boss was weak to fire? For not knowing the attack would be delayed there? For not knowing where the upgrade materials are, or where the NPC summon signs were? If the players are still trying, but failing, that tells me that there's something wrong with the game, not the player. I still stand by my statement that Dark Souls isn't hard. The thing that makes Dark Souls frustrating isn't that it's hard, but that it requires the player to already start the game with some mastery before they can make any real progress and start having fun with the game. The line between miserable defeat and blowing through a level is having already memorized enemy patterns and level layouts ahead of time, because if you know how the enemies are going to act, you can dodge them accordingly and succeed, but if you don't know how to do this, then you're going to make mistakes and just 1 or 2 of those results in failure. Add onto this, the player starts the game with 0 information that could radically change the way you play the game. How is a beginner player supposed to know what the boss's weaknesses are? They can't, because that information isn't in the game. How is a beginner player supposed to know where the upgrade materials are to make their weapons stronger? They can't, because that information wasn't provided by the test creator. Well, is it important for the player to know where the upgrade materials are in order to beat the game? Abso-fucking-lutely. If the games are so hard, then the people who are good at them must be masterclass button pressers, but we aren't. We're just really good at memorizing the answers to a really bullshit test. And people still defend the games and the way that they're designed. I don't think that it's because people think the games are fair or balanced, but because their line of reasoning has been poisoned by From's marketing. Dark Souls is the quote-unquote hard game. If you can beat these games, then you must be a real gamer. The game's called Prepare to Die. Ooh, it's so scary, isn't it? People struggle to admit that the games are bullshit, because if they do, it means they can't gloat about how they beat the hard game. It's just that they cheated the test. Was the game hard? Maybe. Was it a bad test? Absolutely. I've played every single Souls game, and every single time I've quit the game at least one time. I quit at Stonefang Tunnel because I didn't know the enemies were weak to thrusting weapons and I just couldn't deal damage to them. I quit after beating Gargoyles because I couldn't figure out how to get to Lower Undeadburg. I quit at Hyde's Tower of Flame because I didn't know how to get to Lost Giant. I quit after beating Deacons of the Deep because I couldn't figure out how to get to the Abyss Watchers. I quit after beating Cleric Beast because I died over and over to it again, lost all of my blood echoes, and couldn't find Gascon. And for each and every one of these games, I came back with a guide. I followed a wiki, I cheated at the test, and I memorized the answers. That's when I could play these games. Elden Ring was different. I didn't quit playing this game the first time. It wasn't because the game was better designed. It was because I knew to cheat from the very beginning. I knew how to level because I played the past games. I looked up where the upgrade materials were. I looked up where the good grinding spots were. I looked up what the strong builds were, where the best spells were, the strongest weapons. I'm the guy who was shooting shoot-to-whip lasers at bosses and instantly killing them. I was the guy bringing rivers of blood just to beat Millennia. Can I recommend Elden Ring? Not to someone who wants to play a video game. But if you're good at cheating on tests, you're more than welcome to give it a shot.